Okay, welcome everybody. If you're here and just have your screen off, and you want to have your screen off, maybe just turn it on and then off again, so I know you're here. Okay. And just because this makes me kind of insecure, I need to know you're hearing me. Okay, wonderful. Feel much better now. So sama diti, samyak drishti, one is Pali and one is Sanskrit, is the uh, first of the Eightfold Path. Last month, I did a night on the Four Noble Truths, and the Eightfold Path, as I think many of you know, is the fourth Noble Truth. And just by way of foreshadowing, right view is often described as the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths are in the Eightfold Path, and the Eightfold Path is in the Four Noble Truths. I just want to begin by saying that there's so many really wonderful expositions of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And I don't really feel like the best person to give you either necessarily the most perfectly accurate translations or even the most erudite explanations of what the Four Noble Truths are. So I'm just telling you that because there's a lot available, and so many people I respect that would be able to talk about these important teachings that I respect, and you could probably get talks on those. So a lot of what I'm going to be expressing is, in a way, a manifestation of my exploration of these, which is important to me. But I am going to begin with trying to talk a little bit about what I know of as what traditionally is conveyed by this perfect vision. And I'm first going to start with this drishti, or this view. It can be communicated as understanding or knowledge, or literally view. And I have this idea that you could be standing on a mountaintop in a beautiful mountain range, staring down into valleys, forests, looking across to other mountain peaks. And if you've done this, and I really hope you have, you know that you're affected by it, that it just feels different to stare out over a landscape like that, to be taking in just more, you know? And that's not to diminish. I got into this conversation with our good friend Pete, who many of you know. And he was talking about how he likes to be down in the valley looking up at the mountain and like have the trees overhead and to be sort of ensconced in the view. And that makes him feel better. And I like to be on top of the mountain looking out over things. And it isn't to diminish one or the other, but to kind of speak to this notion of view as one's experience looking out at the world. Potentially not just what one sees, but what one feels when that vision is seen. So I say this because the ditthi or drishti has a lot to it. It isn't just an idea about the way things are. It can often seem like that it's like a set of ideas, that drishti is a set of ideas. And it's also not just a perspective, because it's both an inner and outer perspective, right? So it's like what is seen and what is felt when the scene is seen as such, right? So yeah, it can be deep. And I was thinking of, I asked you about a story or a thread, and it's interesting to me. I love stories. I like Netflix. I love reading books. I like fantasy stories, and I like characters. I like to follow characters, and a good author will share just the right elements, right, to make you get into the head of a character, so that you can imagine what it is that motivates them in the story that they go through. And this speaks also to this notion of drishti or view, that there is some kind of holistic world vision, both inner and outer, that makes a person walk through the world in a certain way. And right now I'm not talking about necessarily right view, just talking about view or story or perspective, that we're imbued with that, you and me, and like we walk through the world, and it's not fixed, that just depending on what we think in any given day, or what, good or bad book or Netflix special we've been watching, we're imbued with the views that culture gives us, our parents gives us, we tell ourselves constantly, and these views are shifting all the time, and they sort of exist in the aggregate around us, inside us. What we think about our friends, So I've noticed in relating to my community that there's a kind of thread of the way we think about each other. It's like a story of relationship with the people we're with, and for better and for worse, in a way, we carry our friends with us wherever we go. Our friends and our brothers and our sisters and our parents and our family and all the people we relate to shape who we think we are through conceit and comparison. The images and ideas we have about other people make us how we feel about ourselves. This is also part of this view. Just like our experience is shaped when we look out over a mountaintop, or whether we look up out of the forest and we feel down inside the valley. Our experience is shaped by the way we relate to people in the world. So this notion of drishti or ditthi it's kind of vast, and maybe you're somebody who's into this notion of the subconscious or even the unconscious, that a lot of the story sits kind of just below the surface all the time, informing how we feel and think about our life and our world. And it probably has an effect on whether or not you like to stand on top of the mountain, or like Pete, you like to be down in the valley looking up. It affects your preferences. And it's really hard to really know why, but who we are is made up of all of these stories and all of these relationships. And I think sometimes it can be hard to make sense of all that. So now I'm going to get to samyak or sama, this other word. Sangharakshita goes in his book about the Eightfold Path, goes, he decided on perfect, but he points out that it could be translated variously as proper, whole, thorough, integral, complete, or perfect. One thing I've read, which I can't quote, is that it's, since Shantinayaka told me this, my preceptor Shantinayaka, some of you may know, he used to live here at the center. He said that it means something like together with topmost. And I actually like the word holistic. But as we go into this word samyak or sama, it's helpful to understand that there are 7 more parts to the Eightfold Path. And one of the things connoted or insinuated by this perfection is that it's together with the rest of the path, that it isn't an isolated quality, that its perfection or its rightness or its holisticness or its integralness, its completeness comes from being with the rest of the path. Yeah, that's why I like holistic, but integral is interesting, and perfect is certainly evocative. So all of this is going to lead to me sort of talking a little bit about what this means in the context of communication. But to take a step back to the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha communicated healing communication. So we can take the Dharma to be a communication meant to heal, meant to bring the cessation of suffering. So that's, that's why the Four Noble Truths are in the Eightfold Path, and the Eightfold Path is in the Four Noble Truths, because it's a path of healing. That's one way to look at it. It's a path of awakening as well. It's a path of healing, awakening, healing, awakening. And the Four Noble Truths are sort of like 2 sides of a coin. One half of it is about suffering and the causes of suffering. And the other half is about the great happiness and the way to the great happiness, or happiness and the causes of happiness. And I said last month that it was interesting to me that I have this sense that as I practice, one of the really hard things to do in life is to see both sides of the coin at the same time. Yeah, that was like talking about how you can kind of look at the first 2 noble truths, and sometimes that can really make sense. You know, there's suffering, and that it's not completely unpredictable, that we actually have an understanding and a felt experience of how we exacerbate suffering through our clinging and grasping and greed and lack of generosity and selfishness. But we're missing the other half, that we're missing the inspired vision of freedom, of release, of joyful lightness that the Buddha was pointing to. And they're both, like, that's the Four Noble Truths. It's 2 halves. To see clearly the pain that we have and how we are involved in perpetuating it. If we see it clearly enough, there is a kind of dropping of the weight of it, a setting it aside that is a lightening and a joyfulness. And so again, there are these stories, and woven through all the stories of how we relate to our friends and our family and the people around us is the potential for these 2 sides to always be present. There's always a potential for us to lay down the way in which we perpetuate the difficulty of a relationship or a view. and that in that laying of it down and setting it down, that there is a joy and a lightness. I'm just going to read the first 6 lines of the Dhammapada. I actually meant to get Sangha translation, but this is the one from Access to Insight. Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind made, mind wrought. If with an impure mind a person speaks or acts, suffering follows like a wheel that follows the foot of the ox. That's the first line. The second line is mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are mind wrought. If with a pure mind a person speaks or acts, happiness follows them like a shadow that never departs. The third line is, they abused me, they struck me, they overpowered me, they robbed me. Those who harbor such thoughts do not still their hatred. They abused me, they struck me, they overpowered me, they robbed me. Those who do not harbor such thoughts will still their hatred. Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is the eternal law. There are those who do not realize that one day we all must die, but those who do realize this settle their quarrels. So if we digest the basic thrust of those 6 statements in relationship to healing communication, I think we might get a sense of what this perfect vision, this holistic vision is getting at. That if we're in communication to find out who's wrong, I think we all know what happens when that is where we communicate from. When we communicate to assert and establish who has abused whom, who is manipulating who is taking from who. All that may be true. This is not about saying that that isn't something that happens. But when that is the intent of communication, healing does not occur. Hatred does not cease. So we have this kind of lattice work of ways of relating to ourselves and relating to friends in the world. And I just want to say, these statements are about somebody else, right? They abused me, they struck me, they overpowered me, they robbed me. And that's a story, right? So I asked about a thread or a story, and this is a story. And we often have stories about the people we relate to. But I also want to suggest that we have stories about ourselves. We have stories we tell ourselves, about what you've done to make your life difficult, or what you've done to make your life so great and successful. And I think the Buddha was particularly concerned about the kinds of hatred that arise from blaming others for our difficulty. But the Buddha was also concerned with helping us see through the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves as well. Whether we're puffing up our ego or whether we're deflating it, it doesn't matter. That this notion of right view, this notion of perfect vision, of holistic vision, is one where we hold our suffering as being something worthy of curiosity. That the first noble truth is to know suffering, and to not know it as an idea, but to touch it like we would lovingly hold a friend or a young child. That we hold our suffering with awareness. We hold the pain, the loss, the uncertainty of life, so that our vulnerability and sadness can be touched by love and concern. We take time to be curious about the way in which our difficulties arise and are perpetuated, so that we can see how we take part in that. How our patterns of understanding perhaps create expectations that are unrealistic, or don't help make us reactive, don't help us deal creatively with the world. And so this is the first noble truths. And the way that we make suffering meaningful in this way, the way we hold it in a meaningful way, does bring relief. It does bring peace, and it does allow us to know what to put down. Often, in the Pali Canon, there's a whole sutta. I forget what it's called, but it's a discourse with Sariputta, who you may know, but he's one of the Buddha's lead disciples, and in it, there's this exhaustive list of all the things that constitute this perfect vision. And it begins with knowledge of the wholesome and unwholesome. Knowledge and vision of the wholesome and the unwholesome. And it says that we recognize the root of the unwholesome as greed, hatred, and delusion. We recognize it not as an idea, but as a feeling. We track it into our body. We know what the contraction of selfishness and avarice and hatred feel like down in our body. Which again, I want to say this thing about ditthi, or view. The Buddha talked a lot about knowing and seeing. And, just like in our modern sort of lexicon, to see is to believe. So in the Buddha's time, the notion was that if you see it, it's true for you. But in a lot of ways, the Buddha was also talking about this vision as being a kind of somatic experience, that the knowledge was embodied, not just seen. It was seen and felt, touched with the body. That's how it's often described, touched with the body. So that this wholesomeness and the root of the wholesomeness are touched with the body. One knows what the peace and freedom that comes with loving kindness and the setting down of views feels like. That's right view. And also one knows, conversely, the sort of itch, the sort of contracting heart, the coldness sometimes that selfishness and lack of loving kindness feels like. So right view is this kind of holistic experience of both clearly knowing the unwholesome and clearly knowing the wholesome. It's a vision that allows one to come into relationship with the path. So the rest of the path is in relationship to the wholesome and the unwholesome. There is this kind of, this way of sorting the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, in life. It's directly known for oneself. It doesn't rely on others necessarily. It can look to others for help, but it doesn't necessarily have to rely on others. One knows through this vision the wholesomeness and unwholesomeness that arises in one's heart and one's mind, and knows how to act from that. Going back to the cart following the horse. One just knows what will follow from the kind of heart that they witness, right? So in healing communication, and I just want to say, sometimes I just say nothing in situations where I'm communicating with people that, important communication with people I love that are not going well, that's not going well, and basically relationships that I really want to heal. And sometimes I just say nothing because I know that my heart doesn't have anything good to say. And so I'm waiting for my heart to tell me. I'm not thinking about what words are right. I'm just waiting for my heart to be right, And I think sometimes that's important for us to understand. That there isn't necessarily the right words, but there is the right heart. There is the right view. There is the standing from the right perspective when the words will come out right, when the cart will follow the horse in the right way. And that you can trust that. Then you can do this thing. There's often this term we use in insight dialogue, trusting emergence. Well, yes, trust emergence, but don't trust what emerges from a cold, vibrating with sort of selfishness heart. Don't trust that. That's what right view is about. It knows what to trust and what not to trust. Yeah. And so in communication, we do need to be empowered to know what to trust, know what place to trust when we actually do open our mouths and say something. And that isn't to say that you shouldn't think very logically about what the right thing to say is, because I will say that I've said the wrong thing when it comes from the right place. It also means that the point is that you could say the wrong thing, so to speak, but you're ready to receive the effect of that with an open heart, and then mea culpa. And that's important too, because even if you've thought about just the right thing to say, and it turns out to be wrong, if you're not in that place where your heart is open and you're feeling love and caring about yourself and somebody else, you're very likely to simply defend the effect you had on the person rather than just be open to, oh, that's not what I meant. I'm sorry. Let me take a step back and say that what I see happening is not what I want. And so I don't want to defend what I had to say. Like effect is a lot of, there's a term, a series of statements that are, just because your intent is correct doesn't mean that your effect isn't something that you need to be aware of. Yeah, and we also need to be aware of our effect, and it really takes a lot of, I think, love and awareness to have an effect that you did not intend, and be willing to be kind about that and back off of that. It's what happens is we tend, and I've done this a lot, to just keep saying, that's not my intent, that's not my intent, that's not my intent. But we need to make the space to be able to back off of that and say, and just accept that what our intent was not what happened. And be kind and loving about that. And I'm hoping that you guys see that the Four Noble Truths is a kind of template for that, right? That misunderstanding is to be expected between each other. Like that is to be expected. For us to misunderstand each other. In fact, maybe even tonight, I have no idea if you're understanding what I'm saying. So misunderstanding is to be expected. And especially in communication, which is intended to heal when there is pain and layers of misunderstanding, when you've hurt somebody's feelings or you're in a situation of disharmony with somebody. The first noble truth is really important, that pain is ubiquitous, that difficulty is ubiquitous, that misunderstanding is ubiquitous. And if you've ever heard about the second arrow, there was this notion that when the first arrow strikes you, the first dart, we can just feel the pain and just know, oh, ow, that hurts. Or we can look out and try and figure out who would do this to me? Why me? Why have I been struck by this arrow? It's known as the second arrow. Now you've been struck by the second arrow, not just the pain you're feeling, but the anger and the doubt and all the rest that is related to the arrow, right? So we just go to the pain first and know and just own it as a personal experience, and then recognize that others have this experience. For somebody to be shooting you with an arrow is very likely a painful experience for them as well. And of course, I mean that literally, but I'm metaphorically as well, right? Yeah, so I don't know if you've had this experience, but to talk through the misunderstandings that you have with a good friend who you are in disharmony with, and to be open to that misunderstanding and not have to work all the misunderstanding out, but know that you're pointing the conversation towards a release, towards a cessation of suffering, towards working together to be together in harmony. If you keep your eye on the ball, it's a very liberating thing to be with somebody and be willing to set down all of the past views you have of the other person, and to know that they will arise again, that there will be more misunderstandings, but that there's no worthwhile way to be in the world that isn't about moving towards harmony with the people we relate to. There really isn't. So, yeah, so just to reiterate, hopefully, because I feel like I'm a bit of a rambler, right view or perfect vision, holistic experiential vision is the moment that we realize that through the change that we are and the change that others are, we want to practice the wholesome. We want to support the wholesome. And then we have a vision of what that wholesome is about. One that's not glomming onto or reifying that vision. One that knows that what is wholesome is going to unfold and change in its quality, right? But that there is a movement towards what is wholesome and away from what is unwholesome. And that's just the basic right view. And it's something you feel. It's not something that's just an idea. You have a holistic, somatic vision of what it means to be free from suffering, what it means to be free from unhelpful judgment imbued with greed, hatred, and delusion, chasing, the 8 worldly winds, pain, pleasure, gain, and loss. And the big one, praise and blame. At least I think it's a big one. Yeah. Fame and dishonor. The things that really just cloud our vision, when really we can look towards acts of loving kindness. So we have the 5 positive precepts. With deeds of loving kindness, I purify my body. With open-handed generosity, I purify my body. With stillness, simplicity, and contentment, I purify my body. With truthful communication, honest communication, healing communication, I purify my speech. With mindfulness, clear and radiant, I purify my mind. So often, traditionally, this perfect vision includes understanding those 5 qualities, understanding them in a felt way as something worth not only immediately present, but also worthwhile moving into the future. So that's what I have to say about perfect vision.